In 1993, the United States Senate held a hearing on the state of violence in video games. This is in response to the violent content featured in the video games Mortal Kombat and Night Trap. While these hearings were underway, Doom was released, garnering further public attention to violence in gaming. Mortal Kombat, released in arcades in 1992, was a fighting game in the style of Street Fighter, but featured real human characters as sprites. The game was notorious for its blood and gore, with its fatality system allowing people to be gored to death in a blaze of, well, gory. Part of the reason Mortal Kombat attracted controversy was because of the general tendency at the time to view games as similar to toys, as in primarily as children's products. When Mortal Kombat was ported to both Super Nintendo and Genesis, Nintendo demanded that they remove the blood and gore from the game in order to keep with Nintendo's family-friendly image, while the Genesis left in a code that allowed the blood and gore to be reinserted to the game. Important to note is that the Genesis version of the game outsold the Super Nintendo version 5 times over, meaning that Mortal Kombat's ultra-violent content was a large part of its appeal and its success. The message was apparent: people wanted violence. While there were other games that had been involved in the Senate hearing of 1993, it's also worth noting that firearm-related homicides had been steadily rising from 1985, reaching a peak around 1992 to 1993, resulting in political pressure to try to reduce the amount of violence on TV, viewing that as a potential influencing factor. Joe Lieberman, one of the senators who spearheaded the Senate hearing and got it started, said of games such as Mortal Kombat and Night Trap, quote, "Few parents would buy these games for their kids if they knew it was in them. We're not talking Pac-Man or Space Invaders anymore. We're talking about video games that glorify violence and teach children to enjoy inflicting the most gruesome forms of cruelty imaginable," unquote. From the very start, the panic about violence in games was that it would create violent people, that children would learn to enjoy acts of violence by seeing them depicted in games or instigating them via their own player actions. North Dakota Democratic Senator Byron Dorgan said the following during the trial.
I know we have people who are critics of the bill that you have introduced jointly and critics of those of us who are concerned about violence on television. These critics are similar in my judgment to those who are standing around still counseling us that there's no evidence cigarettes cause cancer. There's no evidence, they say, that violence on television or violence in video games affects our children. Of course it affects our children. If we lost all common sense, of course it affects our children. And it affects our kids in a very negative way.
He went on to say the following about Night Trap.
About 2 months ago, I saw the video game Night Trap for the first time. It is a sick, disgusting video game in my judgment. It's an effort to trap and kill women. Shame on people that produce that trash. It's child abuse in my judgment.
Eugene Provenzo, a professor at the University of Miami who authored a book about the effect of video games on children titled Video Kids, Making Sense of Nintendo, spoke at the hearing and had this to say.
And what I found shocked me. Video games are overwhelmingly violent, sexist, and racist. Now, if the video game industry is going to provide the foundation for the development of interactive television, then concerned citizens, parents, educators, legislators have cause for considerable concern and alarm. I explored the 47 most popular video games in America. What I found out was that violence was the main theme. Of the 47 most popular video games, this is based on Nintendo Power polls, industry polls, 40 had violence as their main theme. My point is that video games such as Nintendo have a marked tradition of extreme violence, which is also combined with significant gender discrimination.
Robert Chase, president of the National Education Association, a labor union for public school teachers in the U.S., said the following.
Electronic games, because they are active rather than passive, can do more than desensitize impressionable children to violence. They actually encourage violence as the resolution of first resort by rewarding participants for killing one's opponents in the most grisly ways imaginable.
The clear narrative of the trial was that video games in 1993 were a danger to children because their violent content would encourage children to themselves become violent. They used a number of appeals to make their case, citing studies on television and then simply deducing that games would be the same way, misreading games' content or exaggerating how violent they actually were in order to suit their narrative, or appealing to some vague notion of common sense. These perspectives are all too easy to debunk. For example, the claim that games affect our children in a negative way and using the comparison to cigarettes causing cancer is a false equivalency. We had studies that suggested a direct causal link between nicotine consumption and cancer. There were not yet many studies to suggest a causal or even correlative link between playing video games and acting out the violence shown in said games, and while studies have since been done on the effects of video game violence on the psychology of players, the studies have yielded pretty insubstantial results as far as connecting video game violence to real-world violence. As well, when Dr. Provenzo made the case that the vast majority of popular video games were violent, I want to point out that the popular video games he's speaking of include racing games, sports games, and platformers like Super Mario Bros. I'll discuss this more later, but when they say violence as their main themes, they are referring to situations such as jumping on a Goomba in Mario or punching people in a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles beat-em-up. So while they used Mortal Kombat as the prime example of this so-called extreme violence, it's worth noting that during this time, Mortal Kombat was the only popular example of said violence. Honestly, there was a sort of dark hypocrisy to the whole Senate hearing when you consider that politicians' whole job is to approve state-sanctioned violence as evidenced by Lieberman's own support of the Iraq War. It's a topic too big for the scope of this video, but I legitimately do not believe that politicians have any right to criticize campy video games like Mortal Kombat for their influence on the public while also supporting actual, real-world military interventions and police action that kill thousands of people both abroad and in our own nation. It all just sort of reads as a smear campaign against video games which were, at the time, largely innocuous in regards to their content, with only occasional examples of ultra-violent games which were, when you look at the specifics of their content, really not that violent and within a context that would hardly lead one to conclude that it has any substantial connection to real-world acts of violence. As well, there's an element of deflection here, in that it takes the heat off of political violence to focus on video game violence. It's a common political strategy, even has a name at this point, which is think of the children. Using the fear of children falling into moral decay has been beneficial to politicians and political pundits for everything from video games, the discrimination against transgender people, against gay people, against women and particularly teenage girls, and on and on. Ultimately, the consequence of this hearing and the discourse of the effects of games on children was the establishment of the ESRB, and as a result, a rating system that would mean that games could be designated as for children or not for children, with the mature rating meaning that an ID would need to be shown in order to purchase the game. I find this sort of funny because I grew up around M-rated games all the time. Children don't normally buy games on their own anyway, but usually have an adult with money purchase the game for them. As a kid, when I would play games, my options were either have my parents get the game for me or play it at a friend's house. If it was an M-rated game, then my parents would just buy it for me, not thinking much of it, because games were for children regardless of content. So an M-rated game didn't seem significantly different from an E-rated one. In effect, the ESRB didn't substantially change the access children had to more violent games, but if anything, it had an opposite effect, where the M rating became a mark of intrigue. If a game had an M rating, that meant that it was extra violent, and thus not for children and extra taboo, and thus more exciting and giving children more of a resolve to want to play it. All things considered, if anything, what these Senate hearings did was enshrine violent video games into legend, and make violence a primary selling point for a consumer. Mortal Kombat excited kids because it was violent. Mortal Kombat 2 excited kids because it was rated M for mature. Violent games sold better and were more popular with children than ever before. Now, the next big controversial game was Doom, but the controversy behind Doom sort of lagged by a number of years. It was a very successful game upon release in 1993, being one of the most successful indie games of its era, and selling around 2 million copies, with its sequel selling around 2 million copies as well by the end of the decade. Doom was more popular with adults than Mortal Kombat before it, in part because it was released to the PC, which was less immediately accessible to children, except in cases where children had access to a computer via an adult who also owned the game. I was one of those children myself, playing Doom's first episode Knee Deep in the Dead and later Doom 2 for years in my early childhood. I didn't know how to run a computer and barely understood the controls, but even as young as 2 years old, Doom inspired something deeply excited within me. I could not get enough of it, and so my parents would plant me at the computer and Doom would, effectively, function as my babysitter. All that said, Doom was also ported to various consoles including the Genesis and Super Nintendo, and these ports meant that the games could be more easily accessed by children who already own these consoles. That was never how I played the game, but I've gotten the impression from word of mouth that a lot of kids did play the Super Nintendo version specifically. Doom attracted controversy early on with David Grossman, a former Army lieutenant who later became an author and police training expert, referring to Doom as a mass murder simulator. I want to focus on David Grossman for a minute. Grossman appears to be one of the leading figureheads on the general US moral panic about video games, alongside Lieberman and Jack Thompson, who we'll get to later. Grossman seems to be frequently involved in discussions of the connection between video game violence and real-world violence. He wrote a book on the matter entitled Stop Teaching Our Kids to Kill. In it, he outlines the role that various forms of media, including video games, plays on the psychology of children. Graphically violent video games like Doom, Postal, Duke Nukem, and Mortal Kombat serve up just what the doctor did not order, and you can see why. The real selling point with these games is that you get to pull the trigger, you inflict the damage, rather than just watching someone else do it. As graphic as the violence is on TV and in movies, it can't quite compete with a medium where you, not an actor, can control the action. It's a whole new level of involvement, and it's terrifying. Television, film, and video game violence may all be imaginary, but the latter lets you put your hands on it, aim, and fire. We don't think we have to tell you how deadly the combination can be of viewing ultraviolent images with the amusement park fun of shooting at things until they drop. More than 60% of children report that they play video games longer than they intend to play. The interactive quality, the intensity of the violence, the physiological reactions all serve to connect the player's feelings of exhilaration and accomplishment directly to the violent images. In the book, Grossman outlines the addictive qualities that games have and draws the conclusion from this that games are leading children towards violent activities. At one point, he cites 2 studies that showed that heart rate is increased by playing violent video games. One of the studies involved young adult men having their blood pressure and heart rate measured after playing billiards versus playing Mortal Kombat, and found that their blood pressure and heart rate reacted more to Mortal Kombat than billiards. His conclusion on these studies is, quote, "These 2 studies indicate that adults with fully developed brains and central nervous systems can be impacted negatively by violent video games. What about children and teens whose brains and response mechanisms are in the process of development?" Unquote. He also specifically isolates Doom and GoldenEye on the N64 as more dangerous to society than TV because they are killing simulators that teach our kids to kill, much the same way the astronauts on Apollo 11 learned how to fly to the moon without ever leaving the ground. Within this argument that games are killing simulators, he outlines the history of military simulations that have been various forms of effective throughout the 20th century. He says the following, quote, "The military learned in World War II that there is a vast gulf, a leap, between being an ordinary citizen and being someone who can aim and fire a gun at another human being with intent to kill, even in war. They discovered that firing at bullseye targets in training did not properly prepare soldiers for combat. Bullseye targets are not humans. They are not even simulated humans. Now these simulators are in our homes and arcades in the form of violent video games. If you don't believe us, you should know that one of the most effective and widely used simulators developed by the United States Army in recent years, Max, is nothing more than a modified Super Nintendo game. In fact, it closely resembles the popular game Duck Hunt, except with a plastic M16 firing at typical military targets on a TV screen." He also brings up a modified version of Time Crisis being used for police training, and later brings up a school shooting in Kentucky which led to a lawsuit from Jack Thompson who, again we'll get to, where it was alleged that several video games, including Doom, were inspiration behind the killings. This is flatly ridiculous, as the killer himself claimed that his motive for killing was that he believed his parents didn't love him, that he would be taunted by classmates, and homophobic bullying. But what's important here is that Grossman makes the case that this somehow ties into the effect games have on children. The way he makes his case is by arguing that Carneal, the killer in question, was mimicking behaviors learned from video games. Specifically, he points to how Carneal fired once at every kid that he shot, aiming with precision, which is not the natural reaction in a defensive situation, but is how video games work, where you fire at each target once, killing them and racking up a high score. I want to address some of this because his arguments are absolutely asinine, so let's go through some of them. First, the argument that having a stimulated response in heart rate and blood pressure to Mortal Kombat over billiards for adult men would say anything about the effect that violent games would have on children is absurd. First, it's a different group, and while we can assume that results might be the same with children, how those responses are interpreted will involve a number of factors, including social and cultural factors, that are different between early adulthood and childhood. They aren't directly analogous groups, so this study says little about the effects of games on children. As well, the study, as presented in this book, is very limited in its scope. We haven't learned from the information provided if the results are due to the violent nature of Mortal Kombat, or if it has more to do with the mechanical design of the game, the fact that it's a game on a screen, or, and in my opinion this is more important, if it might just be that Mortal Kombat is an action game that requires quick reflexes and reactivity, whereas Billiards is a turn-based game that is more measured and methodical with its mechanical design. Mortal Kombat also has a lot to the experience beyond gameplay itself, including the audiovisual content. This doesn't discredit Grossman's argument, but I would argue that the study says very little about the effects that games have on people. Why would an increased heart rate mean that one would be more likely to commit acts of murder? What about action-based sports like football? Do those make people into murderers? Using two very non-analogous activities to draw a conclusion that an increase in heart rate in one suggests that a group that wasn't even studied in this particular research would be more likely to pick up a gun and start shooting people is an extreme stretch. Now, the argument that violent games such as Doom, GoldenEye, Duck Hunt of all things, and Time Crisis are killing simulators is worth calling into question. After all, he himself says that target-based training was ineffective at getting soldiers to be willing to commit to actually killing someone because they were not humans and were not even simulated humans. So instantly, two of the games he mentioned are disqualified. Doom is a game where you shoot demons and monsters, not humans. Duck Hunt is a game where you shoot ducks. His logic collapses on itself. As well, Time Crisis and Duck Hunt being modified into shooting simulators by the military says little about the games themselves. It's been claimed that Guantanamo Bay used the music of Metallica as a torture method against captives. Does this make Metallica's music itself torture? No. The context in which it was used was in addition to numerous other elements of torture, and the music was used in a context that made it torturous. Point being, modifying the game means that the military are not playing the same game as the general consumer population. As well, the context of military training alters the meaning of the experience. Even with all that considered, it's still a stretch to use Time Crisis and Duck Hunt as examples of killing simulators, because Duck Hunt is, again, a game where you shoot ducks, and Time Crisis, although the most similar to a killing simulator, is not particularly noteworthy. But let's focus on Time Crisis for a bit. In Grossman's argument about Carneal, he argues that Carneal's precision marksmanship and strange behavioral psychology when committing a shooting, in which he only shot at each person one time, hitting 8 people with each of the 8 bullets fired, is a reflection of his having learned how to kill from video games. First, and I'm sure most people watching know this, but one shot, one kill is not a very common mechanic in games. Doom and GoldenEye, aforementioned games, require numerous shots to kill enemies. So if Carneal was inspired by those games, then it would not follow that he would only shoot people one time each. Time Crisis is different in that one shot, one kill is actually a mechanic of that game, but there are two things to consider. The first thing to consider is that we don't actually have any reason to believe that Carneal was inspired by this game specifically or had even played it. Yes, Grossman makes the case that it was used as a police training exercise, but he never ties Time Crisis to Carneal's actions, meaning that we don't have any reason to believe that Carneal had ever played games that had a one-shot, one-kill mechanic. The second thing to consider is that Time Crisis only has the player fire one shot if they hit the target. That's how the game is played at peak performance. But most people who have played rail shooters will probably know that the games are designed to be very, very difficult so that you'll keep putting in quarters. This means the targets are very hard to hit, and you're actually encouraged to fire many bullets in order to ensure that you hit your target. Time Crisis is not encouraging people to be precise the way Grossman is implying. See, there's a reason why actual military training involves things like target practice. Targets don't move. Sometimes they do, obviously, but let's not focus on that. In order to get better at precision aiming, you need to learn the basic mechanics of precise aim, precise firing, etc. Still, targets are important because they teach you how to be competent at aiming and firing. Competency is the goal. With a game like Time Crisis, competency is actually the opposite of the goal. The game wants you to not be super good at precision play, because the game makes its money by having the player do poorly. The way the game does this is by having high-octane audiovisual design and having several enemies that move rapidly on screen, requiring hitting several targets at once, many of whom are openly firing at you. There are 2 points about this. First is that when it comes to military and police training scenarios, this kind of situation is flatly absurd. How often are firefights of this caliber happening in real life? Basically never, because A, most forms of gun-related combat in professional contexts involve much more measured forms of combat, such as flanking, cutting off exits of opponents, and B, most forms of gun-related combat involve much more safe forms of combat, specifically by finding cover or remaining out of the line of fire as much as possible. If a police officer or military personnel were to act the way one does in time crisis, they would get killed instantly. And my second point about this is that the situation is absurd because no opposition in a fight would act this way. This is the kind of absurd scenario one would expect from action films, not from real-world combat encounters. It is rare that several people, all armed, stand out in the open, situate themselves in exactly one spot, and fire endlessly until they either kill or die. The game does not lend itself to competency in most regards. So the one game that even vaguely resembles Corneille's actions only does so in the abstract, and when you look at the details of the situation, it can't possibly be tied to Corneille in any meaningful way, except that he had a gun and the game also has a gun. None of Grossman's arguments make a solid case that video games are convincing children to pick up a gun and competently aim and fire at innocent people. But beyond that, the reason I wanted to single out Grossman is because there is a deep irony to his argument when you look at what his career actually entails. Grossman gives seminars all across the country in which he advocates for a form of police training that desensitizes police to the act of killing by teaching them to believe that they are in a war against criminals and that they have to use lethal force in order to protect themselves from criminals. His whole thing is teaching people to be capable of taking a life. He teaches them to worry more about getting sued for not shooting people than for shooting people. As well, Grossman also said during a police training seminar that killing criminals leads to great sex. Grossman doesn't seem all that offended by the idea of murder, so long as it's state-sanctioned. Let's jump ahead in the timeline to the year 1999 with perhaps the biggest gaming controversy, the Columbine High School Massacre. Doom's primary form of controversy emerged in 1999 when the Columbine High School Massacre took place. The Columbine shooters, Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, were reported to be avid fans of Doom, with Harris saying in a leaked videotape that the killing would be like fucking Doom, and that his shotgun is straight out of Doom. A rumor had been passed around for a while after that Harris and Klebold made custom Doom maps to follow the layout of the Columbine High School so that they could plan out the massacre in Doom. This wasn't found to be true, although they had made custom Doom maps, none of them were based on the Columbine floor plan. The association between the two led to further media frenzy surrounding Doom, with further outcry against violent video games and further attaching the act of killing in games to real-world violence. It's hard to deny that Doom played a role in the lives of the Columbine killers, but let's look at this a bit more closely. Let's examine the narrative that was circulating that Doom made Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris into killers. In the year 2000, The Guardian published an article about a study being conducted on the link between computer games and violence. The Guardian brings up the Columbine killers' fascination with Doom as a clear connection. Doom was, at this point, 7 years old and one of many in the now fully formed first-person shooter genre. The article states the following, quote, "They were known to enjoy Doom, a video game licensed by the US military to train soldiers to kill." This is an interesting point to bring up in this article. What the article is referring to is actually true. Doom was used to train soldiers in the Marines. However, it was a modified version of Doom titled Marine Doom, which was made in 1996. Marine Doom was used to train soldiers how to employ military thinking and decision-making strategies in regards to specific scenarios. The default scenario was destroying an enemy bunker, but it could be modified for other scenarios such as a hostage rescue mission. Now, there are 3 points I want to bring up here. Point 1. Marine Doom is not Doom, it's a fan game. This means that Doom was not used to train soldiers, a Doom fan game was used to train soldiers. Point 2. Doom is a work of art. Games are art. They are not simply software. So if we were to assess the nature of violence in Doom, we have to assess it as a text, not simply as a simulator. The violence has a specific context. You are shooting demons, imps, zombies. It is not simply violence. It is sci-fi, fantasy, horror violence. I've played Marine Doom, and in Marine Doom, they modified the game so that the player would be attacking enemy combatants, human soldiers. This means they have modified the text of the game, so the meaning of the violence is altered, and the violence in the game is difficult to state as being the fault of Doom because the commonality here is primarily in both games' engines rather than in its actual meanings of violence. Point 3. Military training is not simply being trained to kill. To kill is doing a lot of legwork in this sentence, specifically in framing. Even that phrase alone could mean several things. Training to kill could mean how to kill, as in competency in aim, use of a firearm, experience in combat, etc. It could also mean training soldiers psychologically, conditioning them to be violent, to be men who kill. These are very different things. But even more different is, for example, hostage rescue or destruction of an enemy bunker. This is maybe me being a bit nitpicky. After all, if you play Marine Doom, it's not substantially different mechanically from the base game. But just playing it for a few minutes, it becomes readily apparent that Marine Doom is not designed to psychologically condition Marines towards murder, nor to teach them competency in combat. It's designed to teach Marines how to think as a team in accomplishing a task on a battlefield. And that truth is the only commonality that the game could have with the original Doom: camaraderie and team strategy. Shooting demons in Doom is not the same as military training, nor does it resemble military training, which is extensive and involves a lot more than just a Doom fan game. What I'm getting at is that the press's perspective at the time framed violent video games as conditioning people to become murderers using manipulative wording. The concrete truth underlying this article's statement on Doom is some Marines have played a Doom mod, but the narrative being supported is Doom makes people violent. The Guardian article primarily centers around a study in which 2 social psychology researchers had junior high and high school students play one of 2 games, Wolfenstein 3D and Myst, one violent, one non-violent. The players were then afterwards asked to punish opponent players with noise blasts of varying intensity. The players who played Wolf 3D were more likely to punish their opponents more intensely and for longer than those who played Myst. The article points out that a critic of the study who worked for the British Psychological Society took issue with the conclusion that one could draw a link between pressing a noisy buzzer versus actual gun violence. Now I want to look at this study because this is an example of just how bizarre the contemporary desire to pin violence on gaming actually was. So the abstract for the article reads as such: 2 studies examined violent video game effects on aggression-related variables. Study 1 found that real-life violent video game play was positively related to regressive behavior and delinquency. The relation was stronger for individuals who are characteristically aggressive and for men. Academic achievement was negatively related to overall amount of time spent playing video games. In Study 2, laboratory exposure to a graphically violent video game increased aggressive thoughts and behavior. In both studies, men had a more hostile view of the world than did women. The results from both studies are consistent with the general effective aggression model, which predicts that exposure to violent video games will increase aggressive behavior in both the short term, e.g. laboratory aggression, and the long term, e.g. delinquency. The study states from the offset that it was inspired by the Columbine shootings and their relationship to Doom. The study refers to a previous study conducted that found that 80% of the most popular Nintendo and Sega games examined were violent in nature. Let's examine this claim looking at the study it came from. Specifically, let's look at their methodology. They contacted 4 rental stores and 2 retail stores and asked them what their 10 most popular games were. This means that the maximum number of unique games that could be sampled would be about 60. They also looked at the ranked 10 most popular games listed by Electronic Gaming Monthly. They ended up having a sample of 33 games. They outlined 4 ways to categorize games according to the presence of violent content: non-violent content, socially acceptable violence such as sports, violence against women, and violence against others. It's not clear in the study how they defined violence, but I want to especially know what games they ended up sampling. Namely, these were mostly Nintendo games such as Zelda or Mario, sports games such as NBA Jam, and a few beat-em-ups such as The Adventures of Bayou Billy or Double Dragon. Only one game was an M-rated ultra-violent game, that one being Mortal Kombat 2. So let's take away from that 79% statistic in some meaningful ways. First off, 27% of the games that were characterized as violent were sports games. I think we can agree that sports simulations are not what is likely to create a mass murderer who uses guns. So instead of 79%, that would bring the statistic of violent games sampled down to 52%. Of the remaining 52%, we get such egregious examples of ultra-violent media as Tiny Toon Adventures and Paperboy 2. The study points out that one might be expected to kick a mushroom in Super Mario Bros. 2 or 3, or knock an object off of a path in Sonic & Knuckles. To get to my point, of the games listed, only 5 games involved violence in a traditional sense. Of those 5, 4 of them were beat-em-ups, one of them being a Ninja Turtles game, and only one of them containing bloody violence and murder, that being Mortal Kombat 2. So that nearly 80% statistic might sound like games are ultra-violent, but what it's actually literally saying is, of 33 games that sold well in a few stores, 1 game had murder in it and 4 of them had punching. That's a hell of a narrative spin. But this is why you need to look at what these kinds of studies are actually saying, because the data is often obscured by the narrative. So let's go back to the primary study of this Guardian article. The study found that people who played violent games for long periods of time were more likely to engage in delinquent behavior, both violent and non-violent, than those who didn't. The study cautions against viewing this as a causal link. It isn't necessarily the case that violent games are making people engage in more delinquent behavior. The study also conducted an experiment in which buzzers were used to punish opponents in the experiment. They found that those who played Wolfenstein 3D used the buzzer more aggressively than those who played Myst. This suggests that short-term aggressive behavior is more likely to manifest from playing a violent game. But it's important to keep this in context. This was an experimental study, meaning that the conditions of the study could skew the results. As well, Wolfenstein 3D and Myst are simply 2 games, and while their first-person perspective and clear distinction between aggressive and non-aggressive play makes them a good choice, the results of these 2 games on participants needn't necessarily reflect the broader picture of violent or non-violent games, especially considering that, for example, Wolfenstein 3D is a 2.5D shooter that runs very awkwardly. As well, it's a game about shooting Nazis. I want to make a point consistently that artistic intent and framing is important in how violence is contextualized. For example, if a game has violence happening to the player versus violence that the player commits, that could be a huge change in how it would affect a participant in a study like this. If all the participants were dying in Wolf 3D rather than killing, would their aggression be heightened or lowered by this? It is not merely the depiction of violence, it's about how the player encounters violence in the game space and the narrative context. If the game were about attacking cows in a field versus shooting Nazis to escape a prison, would the context of the enemy or the narrative alter the aggressiveness? As well, the study was about college students, aging around 18 to 24. So when we say the findings of the study in full, it is a couple hundred 18 to 24-year-old college students were found to press a buzzer slightly more loudly to punish an opponent if they had recently played a game where you shoot Nazis than if they had recently played a puzzle adventure game where you explore an island. I want to discuss the coverage of the Columbine massacre in relation to Doom a bit more. It's easy to point to one article, but I want to paint a broader picture, so let's look at some more examples. This article from the Chicago Tribune, titled "Doom Game Attracted 2 Teens," makes the connection between Doom and the Columbine killings. The article describes the kids as having, quote, used Doom to get ready for their attack, unquote, which might be true, but doesn't really support a narrative about Doom as a game. The article also states, quote, with techno music that pounds from the computer speakers, unquote, which is just hilarious when you know what the music actually sounds like. The article generally describes the game accurately, but makes a point that, quote, as players kill attacking beasts, they rack up points, unquote, which is untrue. They removed a point system in an early draft of the game because it didn't fit with the aesthetic choices of the game and didn't really serve a function, being a vestigial holdover from Wolfenstein 3D, its previous game. The article is fairly benign, mostly reporting on the fact that Doom has been tied to the killers via their fandom of it. Thankfully, this particular article offers a nuanced perspective. One expert they reached out to mentions how violent games can be a release for people with healthy amounts of anger, but when having severe and unhealthy amounts of anger, violent games can only yield further anger, which can be bad for them. I agree with this, and I don't think this expert's opinion or this article particularly advances the narrative against video games, but I still think it's worth mentioning that we can't really pin that kind of anger on the games themselves. One expert, a clinical psychologist from Los Angeles, said, there is research that shows that when you play these things, you become desensitized, that it doesn't bother them, but that doesn't mean that a kid would then go out and do the real thing. When the Columbine killings first happened, President Clinton gave an address in which he mentions the role that Doom played in the killings. The more children see of violence, the more numb they are to the deadly consequences of violence. Now, video games like Mortal Kombat, Killer Instinct, and Doom, the very game played obsessively by the two young men who ended so many lives in Littleton, make our children more active participants in simulated violence. Simulated violence is an important phrasing here, because Clinton got it directly from Grossman, who he mentions by name. A former lieutenant colonel and psychologist, Professor David Grossman, has said that these games teach young people to kill with all the precision of a military training program, but none of the character training that goes along with it. For children who get the right training at home and who have the ability to distinguish between real and unreal consequences, they're still games. But for children who are especially vulnerable to the lure of violence, they can be far more. Clinton does take care to mention gun control and treatment of mental illness, but the bulk of the radio address focuses on the responsibility of the media to not condition children towards violence, adopting wholesale the perspective that Grossman had been promoting for years by this point. Importantly, Clinton doesn't call for a ban on violent games, but instead calls on parents to be responsible in what they allow their children to consume and the entertainment industry to be careful about what it depicts. It's not an altogether bad perspective being put forth, but it definitely further advances the narrative that video games are a primary cause of violence in cases such as that of the Columbine shooters. In 2006, NBC reported on unearthed documents of the Columbine killers professing their love of Doom as well as Duke Nukem. This is another example where the coverage is fairly benign, and it also mentions the Columbine killers' fascination with the Oklahoma bomber as well as their interest in Nazism. In 2009, 10 years after the Columbine killings, the New York Daily News published an article speaking to Dr. David Moore, a psychologist who specializes in topics of addiction. Several of the materials discussing video games in relation to real-world violence discusses them specifically as addictive, which is an emerging narrative, that this is a consequence of an addiction akin to alcohol or drug abuse. Dr. Moore had this to say on the matter. First, video gaming has all of the clinical symptoms of addiction. In a report to be published in Psychological Science next month, Iowa State researcher Douglas Gentile and surveyors from the Gallup poll found that fully 8.5% of youthful video gamers show classic signs of addiction. The Columbine shooters were immersed in their violence-filled Doom video games. What separates Doom from other video games and toys is one big point. They are deliberately programmed to make the player a first-person shooter. You are not controlling a character, you are the character. They should start with the video game's own ratings on violence, with no cautionary game ever allowed in the house. Then get on your own computer. Go right to the media and the family website for descriptions of video game addiction, screening tests, and a whole host of resources to fully understand your child and their friends' use of video games, and how to reverse involvement before addiction sets in. This is an example where we start to see full-on fear-mongering. Dr. Moore is not just saying that video games are addictive and parents should be careful, but is directly instructing parents to ban video games of concern from the home and to treat them as if they are an addict. This is bad for several reasons. First, games as an addiction are greatly exaggerated. People can get addicted to anything, but the reason why drugs and alcohol as addictions are dangerous is because they can literally kill you, and in the case of alcohol, can sometimes kill other people via drunk driving. If someone chooses to spend their free time doing one activity or another, there is no particular activity that having an addiction to doing would not result in some issues, but here games are framed as a uniquely addictive activity and uniquely concerning. I just don't really think that's fair. If a kid spends all his time playing sports, he could sustain serious injuries. He could experience psychological distress in the absence of sports. He could develop anger issues or other serious issues. A well-balanced lifestyle tends to be healthier than preoccupation with any one activity, but games are the only one given that special note of risk here. The most obvious reason why is that the Columbine kids didn't do sports much, but they were obsessed with Doom. That's a fair counterpoint to what I'm saying on some level, but I want to make a specific point that we are more likely to view hobbies or interests as uniquely concerning when they belong to groups that are stigmatized. The Columbine kids were social outcasts, and that's part of what led them to games in the first place. Simply removing games from troubled youth would not prevent another Columbine scenario, but could hypothetically worsen it, because you're not addressing the root issues in the child's life. If the child is socially maligned for whatever reason and uses video games to escape the stresses of his social world, then removing the video game gets rid of having a coping mechanism, but doesn't replace it with anything meaningful. It doesn't give that child social skills or a safe way through a troubling time in his life. It just traumatizes him. But to me, the biggest problem here is that it's sort of just insulting to children to view them as effectively the property of their parents. A parent should help a child integrate into the world, helping the child understand adult responsibilities and how to participate in society. But I don't think a parent's job is ever to serve as a force of dominance. This doesn't teach children anything, and often is just abuse. So forcing a game out of a kid's life when the kid likes the game doesn't make the kid happier or more social. It makes the kid more withdrawn and depressed, and also weakens the connection the kid would have to their parents. I can speak from experience on this. When I had to give up Grand Theft Auto Vice City, I did so because I loved my mom and I didn't want to disappoint her. But I felt guilty, I felt gross, I felt like I was a bad person. I ended up playing the game at other people's houses anyway because it was kind of addicting. Like, I'll openly say I couldn't get enough of that game. I don't regret giving the game away, and I don't regret having played it, including playing it behind my mom's back. I was a kid. Kids do kid things. They don't yet fully understand the world. I don't think that long-term, the situation with my mom affected our relationship significantly, but I will say that in the short term, it definitely affected my relationship to myself in a negative way. I felt bad about myself. Maybe I should have. But Grand Theft Auto also gave me a method of socialization through video games that made up the difference of years of being a social outcast myself. I was never popular and I never had a lot of friends, but all of my friends liked Grand Theft Auto, and so it was a way of keeping those connections alive. My mom was not otherwise very authoritarian about parenting me, but if she had taken away any video game of concern, I don't think I would love her the way that I do now. Not because of the games themselves, but because of what it says about how she feels about me. That sort of overwhelming amount of control, in my opinion, traumatizes children because it deprives them of autonomy. Part of growing up and experiencing the secondary socialization necessary in order to become an adult is learning how to be your own person and not just an extension of your parents. Part of why teenagers end up having a rebellious phase is because their parents make being your own person difficult. I think that making it hard to be able to be yourself is one of the most depressingly common forms of childhood trauma, and when instigated by the choices of a parent, it can harm the relationship that child has to that parent. To me, there's just something disgusting about this whole conversation, this notion that children need to reflect the values and interests of the parent. If a child likes violent games and the parent doesn't, allowing that child the chance to experience the games will probably do a lot more to foster that child's development than disallowing it, because games are culture. Participating in culture is what connects us to other people, and when we can't connect directly through friendships and peer groups, participating in popular culture becomes a way of connecting people vicariously. If everyone is playing Grand Theft Auto or if everyone is playing Minecraft, it doesn't matter what game it is. But if everyone is playing it, then a child wanting to play it is wanting to connect to others in some way. If a child already has a good support system and a good peer group and feels good about their life and their future, then the presence or absence of video games will be less relevant. This is why as adults become more well-adjusted, their love of video games matures with them, and they maybe spend less time fixating on games and instead balance it alongside other interests and obligations. It's good to allow kids to participate in culture. 1999 is an important year to the history of gaming as a culture, specifically because of the Columbine High School massacre. As a direct result of the Columbine killings and the tenuous relationship to Doom, this is the moment when games started to attract major public attention as part of the broader moral panic against violent media. In other words, children are playing violent games and becoming conditioned to desire to commit mass murder became the narrative that plagued the gaming industry and gaming culture for a number of years afterwards, because of Columbine specifically. This meant that every time a new game would attract controversy for violent content, it would open up this conversation time and time again. Video game violence is a societal ill that must be cured through censorship. The next big moment on our timeline of violent game controversy, and I'm sure people expected to get here eventually, was the Grand Theft Auto series, starting most notably with Grand Theft Auto 3. The Grand Theft Auto series attracted controversy from the beginning and would continue to go on to increasing controversy in subsequent releases, but it was GTA 3 that really changed the face of gaming as a culture. GTA 3 was very different from Doom and Mortal Kombat before it. It was, in some respects, the mass murder simulator that Doom was claimed to be. In GTA 3, you could steal cars, run people over in cars, kill police officers and innocent bystanders en masse, shoot people's heads off and watch their corpses spray blood from their neck stumps. It was violent, gruesome, nihilistic, amoral, and most importantly, it was human. Unlike the previous games that attracted controversies, Grand Theft Auto 3 was the first major game to attract controversy for resembling the real-world violence of the Columbine massacre. This was a game where you could, on a whim, just start murdering people on the street left and right, and it upset people a lot. GTA 3 was accused of glorifying terrorism, being released a month after 9/11. It was accused of sexism and sexual immorality, with the option to hire prostitutes for sex and then kill them to take back the money you give them. It was initially banned in Australia and then only accepted when they removed the gore and the prostitutes. And it was part of a string of controversies that occurred regarding the Grand Theft Auto games. The other notorious controversy was the hot coffee mod in Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, which was a hidden piece of code that, when modifying the game, allowed players to experience an uncensored sex minigame. This caused San Andreas to be re-rated as an adults-only game in America, only being changed back to M when the devs patched the game to remove the hot coffee mod. Now, I was there, and I remember the GTA games of that era being downright dangerous to the minds of parents. I was allowed to play Doom, Quake, Half-Life, Alien vs. Predator, Counter-Strike, and Halo with no qualms from my parents. But I happened to get a hand-me-down copy of Grand Theft Auto Vice City, and my mom was so upset she had me get rid of it. I felt really guilty at the time, so I did, and I stopped playing the game. But the thing is, I would go over to other friends' houses and they would be playing GTA, and so I would join them. My story is likely not unique, and there's a reason I bring it up. The controversy surrounding the GTA series meant that a lot of young kids were being forbidden from playing them. This drew attention. We wanted to play them. Simply put, they were more fun than anything else out there, and so we would go to each other's houses. Whatever kid had a copy of GTA or had an older brother with a copy of GTA was the kid whose house we all wanted to go over to. My friend Casey had it, and I spent the night at his house and stayed up literally all night until the sun came up, just shooting random people and running people over and getting in trouble with the cops, not even bothering to play the story. My friend Chris had the game, and I would go over and watch him play for hours until he fell asleep, and then I would play it for hours after he fell asleep. By making GTA taboo and even forbidden in many households, GTA opened up a whole era of socializing over video games by making determined kids have to venture out into the world to find ways to play this game. It was the game that our lives all centered around, which of course made it all the more reason to attract controversy. It wasn't simply that kids would play this violent game, it's that kids were obsessed with it. It was all we cared about. This public preoccupation with GTA, especially among kids under 17, led to a number of attempts to end video game violence. State laws tried to ban sales of violent games to minors. One federal law tried to make it a federal crime to sell or rent M-rated video games to underage persons, full stop. Jack Thompson, a notorious critic of video game violence, was involved in a number of lawsuits to ban violent and sexual content in video games, targeting the GTA series in particular. There was yet another shooting, this time tied to GTA 3, in which two teenagers were supposedly inspired by GTA 3 to start shooting guns at passing cars on a Tennessee highway. One person was shot and injured, and a person in a different car was killed. The boys went to juvenile detention, expressing remorse for their actions and claiming they didn't intend to actually hit anybody. Jack Thompson joined the families of the victims in a lawsuit against Take-Two Interactive, the publisher of the GTA games at the time. He argued that it's despicable that such violent games would be marketed to children. But in effect, that wasn't really true. GTA 3 was marketed from the beginning as a game for adults. Rockstar deliberately prided themselves on courting a market of adult men who would more likely view it in the same line as Goodfellas or The Sopranos than they would Mario Bros. Rockstar wanted to be one of the first companies in gaming to court a specifically adult audience. But that doesn't mean Thompson had no point. After all of my friends and I loved the GTA games and were obsessed. I'd even argue that children and teenagers make up the bulk of GTA's initial massive success. Whether that was a happy accident for Rockstar or an unspoken intention is worthy of speculating, but also beside the point. The games were not really meant for children. That's why children loved them, because we weren't supposed to play them and we all knew it. So clearly, GTA was not trying to affect the minds of children in its content. The game's meaning, its crime film influences and nihilistic depictions of violence is not something that children are being expected to internalize. It's the same as saying Scarface sends a bad message to children. Yes, it does, because children are not the audience that are supposed to receive its messages in the first place. But as with playing Doom at age 2, playing Vice City at age 12 didn't really make me a violent murderer or a nihilistic antisocial psychopath. In fact, Vice City might have even done the opposite. If anything, it helped me socialize more. It helped me connect over a shared interest with boys my age. It gave me fond memories of companionship. But the narrative was becoming increasingly omnipresent in gaming controversy. Violent video games are immoral and make people do immoral things. The thing is, this narrative had continued to become more and more prevalent, but it would eventually crumble. The simple answer is because we did not see a substantial uptick in correlation between violent video games and violent acts. Yes, violence kept happening in America. Mass shootings kept happening. But apart from the Columbine High School Massacre in 1999 and the 2 kids who shot at a highway in Tennessee in 2003, there were no other noteworthy acts of violence linked to video games throughout the course of the industry's increasing success and increasing proliferation of violent content that would see massive success in the 21st century. Discussing the history of gaming controversies would be incomplete without discussing the infamous Jack Thompson. Jack Thompson is an interesting figure, albeit one who gets brought up a bit too emphatically by the gaming community. So let's talk, finally, about Jack Thompson. Usually when people bring up Jack Thompson, they talk about him as if he was the leader of a broader crusade against violent content in games. Really, the truth is more that Jack Thompson was his own one-man crusade against violent content in games. Yes, there were other people involved in the attempts to censor video games, but other than Lieberman's success in getting the ESRB established to regulate the sales of violent games to minors and keep parents informed about problematic content, there really wasn't much to substantiate the cultural narrative of an ongoing war against video games from outsiders. It was really, mostly, just Jack Thompson himself. Let's look at him in more detail. Thompson has blamed several mass shootings on video games. He will often do so before the culprit has even been identified. In one case, he blamed the Virginia Tech shooting on Counter-Strike before the culprit had been identified, and even the NBC article on the topic takes the tone that Jack Thompson is being ridiculous in his assertion. By 2007, Thompson's influence on the discourse had begun waning pretty significantly. His methods are maybe a little suspect. He'll pin popular games and also popular movies on cases of violence committed by young men. However, he loses basically every case for a number of reasons. I'm personally of the mindset that if we see that a man's word matches his public actions, then taking the man at his word is fair. Jack Thompson was interviewed by Inverse.com about his litigation against the gaming industry, and I think it's worth recognizing what he suggests are his motivations. In the interview, he says the following. I was led to games because there was a shooting in Paducah, Kentucky, and the movie The Basketball Diaries influenced the shooting there. That movie was a Time Warner property, so I contacted the lawyer defending the shooter to let him know that 3 years earlier, I'd warned the Time Warner shareholders about copycat violence from entertainment properties, and if he needed me to testify to that, I would. Instead, he asked if I'd like to be a co-counsel on the entire case. That's what got me on the game's arc. Our hook then became proving that the entertainment industries were deliberately marketing things like this to kids beneath the appropriate age rating. The director of the film even gave us a quote that they had added more violence to the film than was in the book it was based on because they wanted to make it more appealing to a teen audience. Every lawsuit ever brought against the tobacco companies for decades was a failure until suddenly one got through and that opened the floodgates. I believe that's my legacy. A much more skilled attorney than I ever was is going to break through. We have more guns than people in this country. That's regrettable, but that's not going to change. Guns are out there, and we are not going to do anything about that. Genie is out of the bottle. So what do we do about the stimuli to use guns in a sociopathic way? What can we do about the culture that glamorizes gun violence? That's what the Clintons were saying long before I even cared about things like this. Guns aren't the problem. Gun violence is. Effectively, Thompson's primary motivation appears to be that he wants games that are meant to be sold only to adults to be sold only to adults. He had concerns about the fact that stores will sell M-rated games to people under the age of 17 because kids aren't yet old enough to process the violent content of said games. He wasn't trying to get games banned, but banning sales of M-rated games to minors. This seems to mostly check out. Most of his lawsuits targeted M-rated games, and most of his efforts to be involved in legislation proposed laws that would ban the sale of M-rated games to minors, suggesting that he did really want to make sure that children are not having access to violent video games in stores without parent discretion. It's also worth noting that Jack Thompson was disbarred for his actions as a lawyer in 2008, specifically for making defamatory and false statements and attempting to harass and intimidate his opponents. He's sort of not a great guy in that sense, but I want to make the case that he's not an opportunist, at least not fully. I think he is a true believer in the actions he's taking, but I do see an element of opportunism in the fact that every time high-profile gun violence cases pop up, Thompson attempts to use it as a platform for having the video game industry held to account for it, even when video games have tenuous or even zero relation to actual cases themselves. His agenda is clear, but his methods are suspect and shady. His disbarment in 2008 is part of the reason we don't hear much about him anymore, but also it's part of why we don't hear about mass shootings blamed on video games much anymore. Thompson was spearheading the attempts to pin mass violence on video games at the time, and him leaving that behind after being disbarred effectively ended the big supposed crusade against video games. But the thing is, we can frame it all day as though video games were unfairly maligned and targeted for censorship and banning, and that gamers are falsely framed as hyperviolent. These things are true on the surface, but the problem is that all we have is surface. There were very few successful attempts to censor or ban video games. They were repeatedly upheld as protected by freedom of speech laws. Attempts to ban sales of M-rated games to minors all failed. Jack Thompson was the only lawyer repeatedly involved in attempting to pin mass violence in video games, and all of his attempts to litigate corporations for selling video games that are violent failed, and he was disbarred. There was a Senate hearing in 1993 that resulted in a rating system, but no games were banned or censored in the process. Rather, any censorship that has happened with video games has been largely voluntary on behalf of the developers and publishers of games, not because of legal censorship, but because they wanted to profit off of their games, and the simple truth is, the more depraved the content of a piece of media, the more niche its market will be. People like violent games, but they don't like too violent or offensively violent, because those games simply don't sell well. There's a great contemporary example, Agony. Agony was a game that was marketed specifically for being horrifying, depraved, gory, and hellish. It literally takes place in hell, features nudity, sexual violence, gore, and in a deleted part of the game, infanticide. Yes, Agony attracted some controversy on social media, but no censorship. The devs released the game and it reviewed poorly and it sold poorly. The reason being, very few people actually want to play a game that is as depraved as Agony. That is not appealing to people. The market spoke and it rejected Agony. So while gamers champion freedom of speech and decry quote-unquote social justice warriors that are trying to get games banned, likening social media criticisms to Jack Thompson, the simple truth is that there is nothing censoring about people criticizing games for their sexual or violent content. If the idea to defend violent games is that the market speaks, then if game developers want to sell to a bigger audience, they have to be careful about how they present violence or sexuality. I will elaborate on this notion in a later section. The big takeaway here is that the crusade against violent games was illusory. It wasn't really a thing. There was a cultural backlash to violent games, but it was not very significant. It felt significant to gamers at the time, but that's because gaming was a bit of a niche market back then that was beginning to enter into the mainstream. We were being spotlighted more, and this led to the sense that games were being fixated on, but they really weren't. Most of the fixation came from Thompson and a few others like him, such as David Grossman, and also from pundits such as those on Fox News, who were fear-mongering to their own audience, but really didn't have much vested interest in actually seeing games banned. The most telling aspect of the illusory crusade against video games comes from that interview with Jack Thompson when he says, quote, "We have more guns than people in this country. That's regrettable, but that's not going to change. Guns are out there and we're not going to do anything about that. Genie is out of the bottle," unquote. In other words, we're going after games because guns are a non-starter. We will never ban guns, which are the primary objects of violence, so we have to seek out other things that could motivate one to become interested in becoming violent. This is a bleak perspective to have because keeping guns easily accessible to people is not necessary for any reason. The conservative argument that it's protected by the Constitution is simply asinine. There is no reason we need to have weapons be accessible to anyone as easily as it has been for these mass shooters. It's been a long time now since video games were a primary target of politicians, but if you're a gamer and you're still mad about cries of censorship due to this history of gun violence being blamed on video games, you should absolutely be in favor of stricter gun control, because games are one of the red herrings to prevent gun control laws from being enacted. Maybe we should do something about the easy access that people have to guns. Stricter gun control laws would likely make the stigma against video games die off, because there would be less gun violence in the first place, and because those who target games would have less of a leg to stand on in order to continue to do so. It's worth noting that a lot of the games that were being targeted were among the most popular games of their era. Doom, Mortal Kombat, and GTA all sold like hotcakes, and their success suggests that violent content was actually much more culturally acceptable than it was maligned. If games could continue to sell really well with violence, then violent games were not some maligned thing, they were mainstream, and that is absolutely true. There are more niche games that were maybe more offensive than their content, such as the neo-Nazi game Ethnic Cleansing or the edgy, deliberately offensive Postal 2, but the thing about these games is they weren't censored, they were simply not very marketable to a mainstream audience. Because people like games like Doom, where you shoot demons and play as a space marine. They don't like games where your violent behavior is accompanied by overt misogyny and racism. That will alienate a large number of players, and I would argue that kind of content makes those games more boring to play. People enjoy fighting demons a lot more than they enjoy fighting racial stereotypes. So games weren't really that threatened by the supposed media crusade against them. The crusade was exaggerated, the consequences were negligible, and the result was honestly that games have continued to thrive as an industry and have only expanded the amount of profitable games that feature violent and sexual content. If you can have games that feature violence as its primary mechanic be among the best-selling pieces of media of all time, then your hobby is not really the victim of anything. We'll expand this conversation to talk about Gamergate and the anti-social justice backlash that began in the gaming community in the 2010s in a later section. But since I've hopefully demonstrated that video games are not the cause of mass shootings, let's look more into what causes there are.